So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to do another table discussion. So, this recording will be me largely kind of asking the questions that we're going to be talking about. It'll be me reading the quotes so we can kind of get started thinking about these. And just kind of as a quick intro, this reading I thought was a very interesting follow-up. Last week we talked about just the cross and what it means to our faith overall. And then the following reading this week deals with Jesus talking to his disciples and the kind of conversation that continues. And some of it's about the cross, but some of it has to, taking kind of an interesting direction. I was also interested that this reading is one that we actually mentioned and talked about last week. So I just wanted us to have the chance to continue wrestling with it and see where it goes. So our reading itself comes from Mark 9 and kind of includes two pieces, one talking about the cross and one talking about Jesus interacting with the disciples. But I guess I'll just jump into it. So in Mark 9, we read, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, 'The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise.' But they didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you discussing on the way?' But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, 'If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all.' And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me.'" So the first question is simply looking at verses 30 to 32, again, when Jesus is discussing the cross, what's keeping the disciples from understanding this blunt teaching from Jesus? They again asked, he says these things, but they didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. So what is keeping them from understanding this teaching, even though he's being pretty straightforward, right? And how do those same sorts of things often keep us from hearing God? In what ways do the disciples' values clash with Jesus' warnings about where he is headed? And why does Jesus introduce welcoming children as part of this conversation? Our next quote comes from one of the sermons by the writer George MacDonald, in which he is actually kind of meditating on this exact passage, in which he takes it in kind of a different direction than I anticipated, but it has a good insight, pointing out that sometimes we can get very caught in kind of childlikeness and child innocence and those sorts of things, right? But in this conversation, Jesus is talking very specifically about welcoming children and the ways in which welcoming children is in fact welcoming God. And so George MacDonald takes that kind of connection between God and this is kind of what he does with it. God is represented in Jesus, for that God is like Jesus. Jesus is represented in the child, for that Jesus is like the child. Therefore, God is represented in the child, for he is like the child. God is childlike. For when is the child the ideal child in our eyes and in our hearts? Is it not when with gentle hand, he takes his father by the beard and turns that father's face upon his brothers and sisters to kiss? When even the lovely selfishness of love-seeking has vanished, and the heart is absorbed in loving. In this, then, is God like the child, that he is simply and altogether our friend, our Father, more than friend, Father, and Mother, our infinite, love-perfect God, grand and strong beyond all human imagination can conceive of poet thinking and kingly action. He is delicate beyond all that human tenderness can conceive of husband or wife, homely beyond all that human heart can conceive of father or mother. He has no two thoughts about us. With him all is simplicity of purpose and meaning and effort and end, namely, that we should be as he is, think the same thoughts, mean the same things, possess the same blessedness. It is so plain to anyone that anyone may see it. It must be so. He is utterly true and good to us, nor shall anything withstand his will. This is the God of little children, and he alone can be perfectly, abandoningly simple and devoted. So George MacDonald, of course, writes very densely, and I'm looking forward to letting people spend a little more time looking at that and teasing it out. But here are the questions. In what ways is God childlike in this quote? Is this how we tend to think of God? Do you think this is how the disciples view God at this point? How might their conversation have gone differently if they had believed God was like this? And why do you think that humanity's response to this God's love is the cross? Finally, just kind of meditating on this idea of the childlike and how it affects our community, I have a quote here from Charles E. Moore in which he's describing two different communities, intentional communities that he's been part of, one of which failed, and then reflecting on what maybe was healthier in the second one in which he's currently still a member of leadership. So he says, looking back, I think one reason our community in Denver fell apart was that we were just too top-heavy with adult sophistication. We suffered from an unfreedom born of pride, overanalyzing our problems and trying to be avant-garde and hip in the name of being relevant. Being childlike is not cool. Being radical was. Had there been more children in our midst, and had we been committed to learning from them, our complex scruples might have evaporated. Our current community is trying to do things differently. Instead of holding long, arduous meetings to process one another's junk and consider every possible angle on a decision, we adults do lots of singing, dancing, playing games, doing pranks, reading stories, and going on hikes that everyone can manage. By keeping it simple, the children in our household point us to Jesus. Our encounters with neighbors and strangers take on a different feeling as well. They're simpler and gentler, more mutual and participatory. Often the children manage to draw out of even the most despondent the childlike gem buried in them. The more we involve the children in our community, the more joy we have. So practically, what does welcoming of children, or maybe the least, actually look like? And how might this be part of taking up our crosses daily? Again, that invitation that Christ is always making in discipleship. So I'm looking forward to wrestling with these ideas with all of you on Sunday as we look at the cross and the childlike and who God actually is.